Hey everybody, what you're about to hear today is a video that actually was a presentation that I made for something regarding my doctoral program, but I thought it might be encouraging or useful to some of you all, so I thought I'd share it here with you. This is about missions. What does it mean to be on God's mission? How do we know if we're on God's mission? Stuff like that. There was some bad internet, so my video in the top right might be like a little janky, but the audio should still be fine and the PowerPoint should be fine. So I hope you all enjoy. So my topic that I'm going to be talking about, your mission, is I kind of want to begin this by asking some questions, some practical questions. Often as theologians, we may ask ourselves questions that aren't the type of questions that a normal everyday churchgoer will ask. So what I want to begin with is some questions that are, as G.K. Chesterton might say, as practical as potatoes. So these questions are, am I shirking my responsibilities as a Christian because I haven't given a gospel presentation to my coworkers or my friends? Should I be doing more missions work? And if so, what type of mission work should I be doing? What constitutes missions? Are some missions more important than others? Is what I'm doing with my life of value for God's kingdom? Am I contributing anything? These are all practical questions, and my wife, when she heard me rehearsing this, gave me thumbs up that yes, these are good questions that normal churchgoers ask, lay churchgoers ask. And so the research question that I have with these type of questions in mind is, what is the proper theological framework to answer these questions? So if somebody's coming to us or they have these type of questions, what is the lens through which we look through, the theological lens to look through to answer these and answer them adequately? And so my research method for this is going to be a historical documents approach. And so the historical documents in question are going to be the biblical text, right? Those count as historical documents. Ancient writings, both Jewish and Christian, and some more modern writings by people like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, stuff like that. And my justification for engaging in a historical documents approach is that I'm inclined to think that when we're doing theology, and since that's what I'm doing here, and kind of trying to find this theological lens, when we're doing theology, we have three broad sources of data for theology: philosophical reflection, tradition, and the Bible. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the three things. And so a historical documents approach gets me at least two of those for sure. So that's my justification for that. And my thesis here is that theosis is the best framework for answering these type of questions. So by theosis, if anyone isn't familiar with that idea, this is the process of becoming more like God and partaking in the divine nature, becoming saints, holy ones, sons of God, being transformed into the glory and likeness of Christ, being transformed from one form of glory to the other, and so on and so forth. And for me, I incorporate with that this idea of being co-rulers with Christ, sharing in governance of creation and things like that. But since I'm using theosis as the kind of theological framework, first, I should probably try to ground this idea in scripture, and I should try to, give some argument for that. So one of the ideas that came up a lot in our, at least in the stuff that I read for our section, is this idea of the Missio Dei, the mission of God. And so what I want to say is, I want to say that we have good biblical grounds for thinking the mission of God is theosis. That's what God has been working towards all along. Is He kind of wants these people who are partaking in the divine nature with Him, sharing in governance. And so to biblically ground that, I'm going to start in the Old Testament, and I'm going to start maybe somewhere that might surprise you. I'm going to start in Genesis 15. So in the Old Testament, there are these sections where God gives these promises to Abraham. That happens, God kind of has these ongoing interactions with Abraham. And some of the writers, so for instance, Timothy Tennant goes to the promises to Abraham to ground this idea of, okay, it's the missions are supposed to be to the entire world, and he goes to it these promises to Abraham to kind of ground the all nations aspect. But I want to go to Abraham and these promises for grounding a missional kind of framework or lens for a different reason. So in Genesis 15, this is the famous case in which God comes to Abraham, takes him outside, says, "Look up, look at the stars, try to number them. You can't, so shall your seed be." And a way that a lot of us interpret this is to say that, oh, okay, this is God communicating to Abraham, hey, you're going to have a whole lot of descendants. It's quantitative. It's about how many there are going to be. But I would say that if it's just quantitative, that's probably an improper reading. It's qualitative, not just quantitative. It's not just about this is how many descendants you have. This is what your descendants are going to be like. And now I don't have a lot of time to get into this, so I'm going to reference a paper here and just kind of give the broad strokes. So in the ancient Near East, stars and celestial objects were associated with divinity. There was a conceptual link between those two. And so when God says to Abraham, hey, look at the stars, this is what they're going to be like, there's grounds there for Abraham to interpret that as a type of deification or connection to divinity or stuff like that. And if we look at some early Jewish writers, we see them making that connection. So for instance, we see this idea in the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. We see this idea popping up in Philo of Alexandria when they're talking about these promises, this idea of it's not just qualitative. This is Abraham's seed are going to be like this in their splendor, in their purity. They're going to be exalted in power, all these kind of conceptions. And David Burnett connects this idea and says Paul himself picks up this idea in Romans 4:18. So we see this in some Jewish sources there. We also see this a little bit, I think, in the Apocalypse of Abraham. I'm also going to note here to kind of round out this section of the Old Testament. You could also argue that this type of promise that God is making to Abraham is kind of a bringing things back or fixing what was broken and what was lost in Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1, there's this idea we're made in the image of God. And some Jewish writers, I think this pops up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's this idea that Adam pre-fall was he kind of looked like a god, like he looked what we might say as like a divine figure. He was bright and shining. There's language of him being garbed, him being robed in these garments of light and things like that. So there's at least in some Jewish conception this idea of Adam was if we would see him, it's almost like how we would see these figures in Daniel or Revelation or stuff like that, this kind of glorious and having all this splendor. So again, there's two papers there that if anyone wants to read more into that idea. Then, of course, this idea pops up again in the New Testament. We get this idea that we're going to be seated in the heavens with Christ. We get this idea that we're going to be the new sons of God who will be revealed to govern creation. So sons of God in the Bible and the Old Testament, but also just in the ancient Near East in general. There's this idea of those are these kind of celestial or divine figures in the Canaanite pantheon or religious system. They're referred to as the sons of El. In the Old Testament, we also see sons of God as being used to refer to these type of, divine beings. We see this in Job and things like that. But then that language gets picked up to describe what we get to be in the New Testament. We get this idea, we're being sanctified in Hebrews. Jesus says those who persevere to the end and keep his works, they're going to be given authority over the nation. So there, I'm incorporating this idea of co-governance with this theosis concept. We're to be co-heirs with Christ. We're going to be partakers of the divine nature. Like that's something that people like me, like I'm doing my dissertation on some stuff related to Christology and things like that. I don't think quite we fully take into account this statement about how the Bible uses the divine nature when we use divine nature when we talk about Christological things. But there's this idea of, in some sense, we're going to be partakers of the divine nature. We're going to be transformed from one degree of glory to another, as Paul tells us, so on and so forth. So with all that said, so that's kind of my biblical backdrop. And then I'll make a brief note here that also this idea pops up in the early Christian writing. So Athanasius has this famous saying where it's something like, God became man so men could become God. And then there are some, this is an idea, it pops up a lot. I could probably find quite a bit of early church writers who talk about this. One Byzantine monk, I think it was, is someone I referenced in my literature review paper. It's Niketas Stethetos. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but check out the paper I posted if anyone's interested in some quotations from him. So let me give some litmus test for, with this idea in mind, let me give some litmus test for asking these type of missional questions now. My litmus test for are you doing missions is, are you helping to grow the number of people who are on the theosis journey? So I'm going to liken this process of becoming more godlike to like you're on a trail, you're on this trail hiking into the mountains, right? Like this is kind of my analogy for the theosis journey. Are you helping more people to find the trailhead and getting them walking in that direction? So that's question one. Question two, are you helping people who are in their theosis journey already? Are you helping people who are on the trail? Are you giving them water? Are you giving them shelter? Are you giving them refreshments? Are you helping them guide them back on the path when they get lost? Are you encouraging them? Things like that. And so what I'm going to say is if you're doing either of these two things, congrats. You're doing missions. You are participating in God's mission. And so let's take that. Well, so I want to kind of flesh that out now with a couple of remarks from C.S. Lewis. I was going to throw Tolkien in the mix, but I had to cut some of that for time. So C.S. Lewis has this idea, and he doesn't explicitly talk about it in the idea of theosis, although I would be surprised, I think, probably if he wasn't aware of it. So he has this remark in Mere Christianity where he says, every time you make a choice, you're turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning the central thing into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. So there's this idea here of us participating in the theosis we're doing. There's this idea of almost we're practicing orienting ourselves toward God and going in the right direction through these choices we make. And so this is kind of a quote that is it's all about how our actions affect ourselves. But Lewis has another quote that is one of my favorites from him, and it comes from Weight of Glory. He says, "It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you'd be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. And so this quote from Lewis is really kind of a focal point of how I view missions on and how I see this idea of how are you helping people along their hike into the mountains. So there's this idea of when I do an action, I'm turning something inwardly myself, but potentially I can be helping other people either by teaching them or maybe showing them loving kindness, stuff like that. I'm helping them make decisions that are going to turn that little dial in them into the right direction. And so with that idea in mind, I want to, and with kind of this theological framework, right? I want to look at some test cases. So I started this with some practical questions. Let's look at some test cases for missions and see, are these people doing missions based on this kind of framework that I've provided? So you got a person who they travels to an uncontacted tribe to preach the gospel. This is kind of like the most stereotypical missions thing, right? I would start us off with something easy. Well, yeah, okay, they're doing missions, right? Like there are these people they've never even heard of this kind of journey into the mountain. They don't know this trail's there, and so you're preaching the gospel, you're sharing it with them, you're meeting that first litmus test. What about a preacher giving a sermon? So there's I think probably a couple pastors or preachers in here, so maybe you guys on the edge of your seats with this one. No surprise, yeah, like you're also doing God's mission. Why? Well, you're also helping people find the trailhead. You're also getting them onto that path, but you're helping people who are already on that path. You're helping them walk with God more. You're helping, them in their spiritual practices, stuff like that. At least I imagine. I'm not a pastor, but I think that's what you guys do. You guys can, correct me on the feedback form if I get that wrong. So what about a person who's serving in the nursery on a Sunday morning? I'm also going to give two big thumbs up. Why? Because one, a person who serves in the nursery, when they do those interactions and they interact with children, if they're doing it well and they're not being like really evil, mean people, they are turning the dial in themselves. They're practicing virtue and they're making choices, which I think are turning them into the heavenly creature, so to speak. But they're also doing things which will hopefully help those children in their own theosis journey, right? They're showing them love, they're teaching them things, they're showing them kindness, ideally. And so they're helping the children, they're also helping the parents, I imagine, right? Because if you're a parent, you want to go and worship, but maybe if you have a screaming child next to you in the middle of a worship service, maybe that can interfere with that. So they're kind of giving them a break, a refreshment, so on and so forth. So I would say someone who's doing this nursery work on a Sunday morning, yeah, like they're helping people who are on that journey. They're doing God's mission. A person volunteering at a homeless shelter, even if it's just stacking boxes or giving soup to people, I'm gonna say like same thing, and for the same reasons as the Sunday morning. What an artist who creates a picture or a story or a song, even if it's not overtly about the gospel. I'm also going to say, well, yeah, potentially, two thumbs up because that can be used. So I was going to talk here about Tolkien. I was earlier when I was after my C.S. Lewis, I was going to have a little plug about Tolkien's book Leaf by Niggle. I'll just tell you if you haven't read that, go read Tolkien's very short work Leaf by Niggle. I think it's something like 20 pages, very short. It's an allegorical, autobiographical way in which Tolkien talks about how he hopes his own work will be used by God and how he hopes it will be able to introduce people to the mountains. This idea of using his work to kind of get images. And that's an idea that some people have testified has done that for them. So for instance, Holly Ordway, who's a big person in the imaginative apologetic scene, has talked about how even when she wasn't a Christian, through the imaginative works of people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, I think the way she phrased it is she first encountered grace through them. And so even though or Lewis, for instance, he talks about encountering holiness for the first time through one of George MacDonald's books, even though it isn't overtly about the gospel. It's so there's ideas there that kind of seem to hit him and introduce him to these ideas that he'd only fully get later. What about a stay-at-home parent, right, who's caring for their kids? Well, probably to nobody's surprise, I'm also going to say like two big thumbs up. You're engaging in God's mission, at least potentially, because you're engaging in actions which are probably growing your virtues of kindness and patience and things like that. So, if you're at least making some of those decisions well, you're turning that little dial in yourself in the right way. And then also you are helping your children, if you're being a good parent, you're helping them to find that path and to learn how to walk on it and things along those lines. So at this point, I have about a minute left. So I'm gonna address a potential objection, and this potential objection is, well, this just makes everything missions. Like you have defined missions so broadly, like your little litmus test is so broad that you can constitute everything, or almost everything, as missions. And my response to this objection is Yeah, isn't that pretty cool? It's almost like God uses all things to work together to his good. It's almost like God has this great big body and like we all have these different skills and God can incorporate and wants to incorporate all those different things into his mission. So anyways, that's my I'm tempted to say, like, oh, thanks for coming to my TED Talk, but I know I've probably been talking quickly, so maybe I should say thanks for coming to my like rap album debut, but that's all I've got.